Cleveland Council on World Affairs. I'm Steve Peters, Chairman of the Board. It's a pleasure to welcome you here tonight. My job again is to introduce the person who's going to introduce our speaker tonight, Ambassador Brill. A couple of points though. I want to ask a question. How many here are interested in international issues? How many here think that the importance of learning about international political relations is important in your own life and for the United States? And how many of you here are members of the Cleveland Council on World Affairs? If anybody didn't raise your hand for the last question, you can't answer yes to the other two.
You're getting worse.
Hard sell.
So, Fareed, who's on the board as well, won't let you leave until you join. All right. Well, anyway, welcome. It's a pleasure to have you here. If you believe, as you answered that you did, then please consider joining if you're not a member. We have a program coming up. It's actually this is the second last program of my term as chairman. The last program is on June 13th at Shake Country Club, where we will have our annual meeting. We hope you all attend. There's no cover charge for that meeting, and we will have Ed Fitzgerald, the county executive, speak to us that evening about the importance of international relations to Cuyahoga County. At this time, it's my pleasure to ask Heather Hodges, our president and ambassador in residence, to introduce our speaker. President.
Well, good evening, everybody. Very glad to see some new faces, and I will reiterate what Steve has just said about signing up, or at least look at our website and see the programs that we have. We've had some great programs this past year, and we're lining up our programs for next year, which I think you will enjoy. I don't want to contradict my chair, however, we have one more program on June 14th after you're no longer the chair, which is we have the U.S. Ambassador to Slovakia, Ambassador Sedgwick, who is from Cleveland, is going to be here, and he is bringing with him the mayor of Bratislava. And so they're going, and this is an event that is co-sponsored with Sister Cities Cleveland, and which is paired with Bratislava, and that also should be a very interesting event. And that is also here at the Union Club on the 14th. Right? Our topic tonight is U.S. diplomacy in the 21st century, and I think that our guest speaker is one of the finest examples we could have of somebody who has done things in diplomacy in every shape and form, it seems, over his 35-year career. He joined the Foreign Service about 5 years before I did, and I have to admit that over the years I kept seeing his name, but we never met in person until today, and I was shocked to discover how tall he was. I just, it's one of those things, you get this image of people. And so I'm really very glad to have finally met him after, seeing him and, from afar in various positions. He was he is currently the president of the Fund for Peace, and you've been there since 2010. And then his last assignment before he left the Foreign Service was as founding director of the U.S. National Counterproliferation Center, NCPC, which is part of the Office of the National Intelligence, Director of National Intelligence, the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. And he served there for 5 years. Right. His overseas assignments included serving as the ambassador to the IAEA and to our UN mission in Vienna. That has got to be one of the most complicated assignments that one could possibly have in multilateral diplomacy. He was also our ambassador in Cyprus, and he was chargé d'affaires and deputy chief of mission at our mission in New Delhi, Mexico, and New Delhi, India. I keep slipping in these Latin American references when I get up here. And our political counselor at the U.S. Embassy in Amman, Jordan. His domestic assignments in the Department of State included being the acting assistant secretary and principal deputy assistant secretary for the Bureau of Oceans and International Environmental and Scientific Affairs. He was also executive secretary of the department, which for those of you who don't know the department is it's sort of being right up there with the secretary and the decision makers, and is for people who work at the department, it is truly considered one of those great positions. And he was special assistant to the secretary and director of the Office of Egyptian Affairs. Ambassador Brill has written and spoken on the subject of nuclear non-proliferation regime, countering the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, the challenges of WMD terrorism, the environment as a national security issue, and U.S. intelligence reform. I sent our members an article that he had written. I sent that out a couple of weeks ago. His subject tonight is, U.S. Diplomacy in the 21st century. But I'm sure that he will be willing to answer any questions on any of these subjects. He's a graduate of Ohio University, and he received his MBA from the University of California at Berkeley. So, Ken?
Thank you very much, Heather and Steve, for the warm introduction and the invitation, and I hope everybody can hear me and that the videographer has been able to find my good side. And if she will let me know where it is, so I can use it in the future.
Little switch on the side of that clicker, the clicker. Little switch.
Right. Okay. You're about to see a remarkable event that doesn't really happen very often. That is a State Department person speaking to the Department. Particularly a State Department person of my generation. They don't train us to do PowerPoint, but I learned it when I was teaching at a work college. I wanted to try to do it tonight, see if it would work out. This is my first visit to Cleveland. I spent 2 years in Athens, Ohio, not Greece. And first visit to Cleveland, heard a lot about it. I'm really glad to have the opportunity to be here. And I want to congratulate the Cleveland Council on having such a distinguished president. Heather was a very distinguished former colleague. But I see that Bill Rosner's here, and Bill and I served together in Ghana, but Bill has another distinction. And that is that he was one of the few people brave enough to come and visit me and my family when we lived in Calcutta, India. Not many people did that. Now, I spent the last 4 years of my, 4+ years, almost 5 years of my career in the Foreign Service and the intelligence community. And so tonight, I want to let you in on a little secret. And we should close the door. The international security environment is changing dramatically, changing rapidly, and it's affecting our interests, and it's affecting the things that we believe are important, our values. And if we're going to protect our interests and our values, we're going to have to recognize those changes and deal with them. Now, that may not sound like a secret to people here at the CCWA. You all are well informed, either as students or as members. But if you listen to some of the debate in Washington, and if you look at some of the numbers coming out of the budgeting process for national security in Washington, you'd have to conclude that that secret I just gave you may not be a secret to you, but it's a secret to a lot of people in Washington.
On the right side, there's a little switch. On the side.
That's what happens when the power.
We even did this.
No, I turned.
This is a different one?
No.
Okay, that's it. Okay, I'm going to flash up a few little things here. Some of them may look familiar to you as headlines, or issues you're interested in, or things you thought about, or things that are affecting our own politics. This is the new normal. And what I want to talk about tonight is what's driving the new normal in terms of international affairs, and what that new normal means for our national security and for our diplomacy. But I also want to talk a little bit towards the end about the disconnect that exists today between the rhetoric, the political rhetoric, about America as a global leader, and the budgets that we're getting that will produce what I would argue will be American decline. So, globalization is going to shape literally everything we talk about tonight. So let me unpack the term. Globalization is driving the new normal. And what do I mean by globalization? Well, first of all, this is an academic. Those students in the room may have run across something like this. This is a good scholarly definition of what I think globalization is. And what's really interesting about this is that it's unorganized, stateless pressures that over time affect states and state capacities. Maybe I'm moving out of the video frame. I'm sorry. I'm a kinetic kind of guy. The changes that are being produced by these unorganized pressures are affecting states in different ways. They're also affecting groups within states in different ways. And so as a result, globalization is changing the relationships between groups within states, as well as the relative position of states to each other, the power relationships in particular. Now, I would say that globalization has not made the world flat, which is Thomas Friedman's term, but it has certainly made it a lot different. And it's a lot different than it was at either the end of the World War II or the end of the Cold War. And what we're seeing now in terms of globalization is really the sort of second phase of modern globalization. The first phase began at the end of the Cold War. This phase began in the O's. And if anybody has any questions about the first phase, I'd be happy to talk about it during the Q&A. Now, I am going to argue that globalization has 10 aspects that affect our national security and our diplomacy. Let me run through them reasonably quickly, mindful that we have some time constraints here. Rising states and the dispersal of global power. The United States is obviously still the leading power, but we're no longer an uncontested superpower. There are rising powers. We could have a little Q&A session here right now, who they are. I mean, obviously China, India, Brazil, Turkey. There are a number of states that are rising. There's some states that are going down. Greece is an example of a state going down right now. Italy and Japan are both states that had more power 20 years ago than they do today. So some states are coming up, some states are going down. And what this means is that we have new actors on the scene. That doesn't mean we're going to necessarily have war with these people, but we have to take them into account because they matter, and more importantly, they know they matter. And there's a reason why the G20 is the number you hear more often now than the G8. And that's because of rising states and the dispersal of global power. We also have empowered non-state actors. Now, what's an example of a non-state actor? The first thing that comes to most people's minds are terrorists. Terrorist groups are clearly empowered non-state actors that make a difference in global security and the global security environment. Anybody gone to an airport recently? But there are other examples. For example, multinational corporations. If you didn't think they had much impact in the past, 2008 may have changed your mind. And there's a new book out now by Steve Cole, who's written actually a wonderful book about Afghanistan too, and Pakistan, but it's a book about ExxonMobil. And that book makes it very clear how large multinationals can have their own foreign policies, have their own domestic policies. These are non-state actors that make a difference that we have to think about from a national point of view. And then finally, wealthy individuals are also non-state actors. It's really interesting, but here's a fact I want you to file away. The Gates Foundation, which is funded by two families, in the last decade has spent more money on international health than the World Health Organization, which is a multilateral organization with 193 member states. So great wealth can have a big impact on things that matter for us from a national security point of view. Science and technology is no longer held. The United States, back in the good old days, the United States was the leading S&T power. We led an investment of new science and innovative technologies. And we're still important in that regard. But there are a lot more states that are in the game. And if you take a look at some of the proliferation networks, the WMD, the Weapons of Mass Destruction Proliferation Networks, that you have read about in the past, you would see that the sourcing for some of this high-tech equipment is coming not from the West, but from places like Malaysia and other things. And if you take a look at where some of the big investments are being made in S&T around the world today, it's Asia. There's a lot more investment in China and in Korea in S&T than there is in the United States. So this has very significant implications for national security and our diplomacy. Acting on rising expectations. The globalization is not only affecting people's views of what their lives ought to be like, it's actually giving them some tools to do something about it. I think you've had a speaker here on the Arab Spring. The Arab Spring is really about unmet rising expectations and people taking advantage of the tools of globalization to do something about it. And we're now into the second day of the Egyptian election for president, first ever in its history, a contested election. This is going to affect a lot of countries. If you look at Greece today, if you look at India, if you look at Israel, if you look at Russia, you see rising expectations causing political pressures, political change. And we haven't even gotten to China or even Cuba yet, but it's going to happen. This is a fact of life and globalization. Economic interdependence. Sort of the sine qua non, as we like to say. We just like to throw around Latin in the State Department. Get some law students here now, so we can handle that. But economic interdependence is obviously part of globalization, but it's hugely important from a national security and a diplomatic point of view. We used to export a lot more food than we imported. Now we import as much food as we export. And when Fukushima happened, the tidal wave, the tsunami hits Japan, Fukushima, the nuclear stuff happens. What happened to the Toyota supply line? What happened to your ability to buy cars here? I mean, markets are connected, and that interdependence is something that manages to affect us in many, many ways we wouldn't think of. What happens in markets anywhere can affect markets everywhere in today's world. If you don't believe it, just think about the global financial contagion in 2008, and think about all the talk about Greece leaving the euro today and what's the impact on us and others. Cyberspace, we invented it. Not just the term, we invented cyberspace. But it's been democratized. Cyberspace is the oxygen of globalization. Everybody's in it. And everybody's using it. And a lot of people are using it for malafide purposes. And those are states, but also non-state actors. And non-state hackers are as big a problem from a security point of view as state hackers. This is an issue that is going to loom larger in the decades ahead, diplomatically and otherwise. Along with economic interdependence comes a competition for resources. We have never really had to compete as a country for resources since we became a great power. And that was well before World War II, actually. But we are today. And what's interesting is there was a period earlier this year when gas prices were rising in the United States while the demand for gas was dropping. Does that make sense? It really, from a maybe classic economic point of view, if you think about the United States, it doesn't. But we're part of a larger market now. And what happens in those markets affects us here at home. We're competing for resources. That competition for resources affects prices everywhere. The environment. The global environmental challenges such as climate change, the depletion of the fisheries, growing pressures on freshwater supplies, these are all things that are going to have an impact in specific regions, in some cases, and globally in others. And the impact, for example, of water rising in the Bay of Bengal and beginning to flood large parts of Bangladesh, refugees coming out of there, going into neighboring countries. You can just imagine a kind of a ripple effect. You can imagine the same thing in the Caribbean. As island states tend to get pressure. We're going to have more immigration into Florida, whether we want it or not. We may. So the environment is going to be something that will be an increasingly important issue for us, and part of the environmental challenge is being driven by resource competition and economic interdependence. It's related. Failed states. In today's world, states fail and they can stay failed. In the past, states were beaten. You know, there was a war, somebody took you over, and then they had a responsibility for it. But in today's world, states can just fail. I mean, Somalia is a good example. Liberia is a good example. The Democratic Republic of Congo is a good example. Afghanistan is sort of an example. And the tools of globalization actually help warlords in failed states keep themselves on top, keep the state failed, make it harder to fix it. And failed states are going to be a challenge because that is where you're going to find, I think, in the future, more conflict, not less. And then finally, the number 10 item, sort of a catch-all, you should expect the unexpected. As the world and the global community and global business and global governments get more and more connected, perturbations in the system are going to have unintended effects. And so globalization is going to make the law of unintended consequences even more apparent and even more enhanced. We're going to be dealing with challenges we cannot anticipate. They're just going to happen. But each of these things that I just outlined is going to have its own specific set of diplomatic and national security challenges. We'd be happy to talk about that during the Q&A if people have an interest. But taken as a whole, they also impact the total global system. And they impact the mechanisms and institutions that we set up after World War II to sort of manage the Cold War and even the post-Cold War period. And these challenges are coming in so many different ways and creating a new range of problems that the international system is under more pressure today than it's probably been under since the early part of the 19th century, when Napoleon upset completely the balance of power in the world that mattered to most people in the West at that time, which was Europe. Because globalization is producing new Napoleons in terms of leaders, in terms of countries that matter that didn't, and in terms of issues that matter that didn't in the past. And so the global system is going to have to accommodate a whole range of new actors, new issues, some of the things I outlined earlier. Has to find a way to do that and still maintain peace and stability. So how do we respond to this changed world? Well, first of all, we need to recognize that it is changing. If you're going to manage a system so that it works, you have to recognize that things have changed and the old system doesn't work. And you have to recognize that you have to adapt to what's happening outside you. And we can discuss whether the American political system has come to that point of fully recognizing the changes that we're having to deal with. But if we fear change or we act negatively to it, then we create problems for ourselves. And I know we have some businessmen in the audience today. Business doesn't make money by ignoring changes in the marketplace. You adapt to the changes in the marketplace to prosper as a businessman. We need to do the same thing as a government, thinking about your national security and your diplomacy. One of the things we need to do in order to change this, to respond and deal effectively with this changed world, is we need to be thinking about how we succeed through collaborative leadership, not as the sole remaining superpower or the leader of the free world, terms that have kind of outlived their, not just their usefulness, but their relevance. We need to be thinking of national security and diplomacy as a team sport. And we want to be the captain of the team. We don't want to play it as an individual sport. I mean, we did that after World War II. We had a lot of big ideas, a lot of big initiatives, and we paid for that mostly ourselves in our own treasure and our own blood. And I would argue today that we need to think about how we get other people bear the burden, share the burden with us to accomplish goals that we think are important. And in today's world, if you use collaborative leadership, you're really using soft power. Soft power is a lot cheaper than hard power. And the fellow who coined the term soft power, Joe Nye at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government, has a very nice new phrase, which is, we should move from being the Lone Ranger to being the smart arranger. Which is another way of saying you succeed through collaborative leadership. We need to learn to like multilateral institutions. That may sound kind of odd. The United States was a chief architect of the international system that developed after World War II. We helped design the UN, the Bretton Woods institutions, and other things. But multilateral institutions have always been a whipping boy in our political system. The UN is to be feared. black helicopters, you know, like they're the enemy. When the shortcomings of the UN were purposefully built into the UN by the US and those states. We need to realize that if you're going to lead through collaborative leadership, we're going to need to use multilateral institutions. We have to think of them as tools, and we shouldn't be thinking about them as a nuisance, which has been the way a lot of people in our country think of them. We also need to build a team at home if we're going to lead abroad. We need to, you know, our current law that governs our national security agencies was written in 1947. I was born in 1947. Do I look as good now as I did then? No. I was a cute little kid. There's a law written in 1947, even though it's been amended a few times since then. Do you think that's as relevant for today's world as... No, it's not. We need to make changes in the way we think about how we organize ourselves to pursue our interests abroad. We need to make changes at both ends of Pennsylvania Avenue. The Congress has a committee system that sort of balkanizes the national security agencies. And in the executive branch, I'm proud to say that we've actually learned some very hard lessons from Iraq and Afghanistan. We are doing things in a much more integrated way now, much more interagency. But there's still changes that we need to make within the executive branch, but without support from the Congress and changes in the Congress, it's not going to happen. We need to think about how do we apply all the tools of statecraft that exist in our government to our national security challenges abroad, our diplomacy, in ways that we haven't in the past. We would think of this as a team sport at home, not just a team sport overseas. And we need to think about issues differently. I mean, and I'll use a term that Admiral Mullen, who was formerly chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff until last October, used. He said we need to really demilitarize our foreign policy. If we organize ourselves to be a hammer, to use kinetic force, then everything looks sort of like a nail. And you know, there are a lot of people out there who don't see themselves as nails and who want to be consulted. We have to think about how we lead collaboratively. That requires thinking about things in different ways. Our national security thought leadership in the past has been led by DOD, the Defense Department, largely because the Defense Department had the money. And they bought the think tanks, and they established think tanks. And if we're going to be successful in this new world, we have to do what Admiral Mullen has recommended, which is to demilitarize our foreign policy, because the most challenging issues we'll be facing, if you looked at the first slide of all those things that make up the new normal, if you look at the 10 aspects of globalization that are going to affect us, very few of those involve or are responsive to the kinetic approaches of military force. So, how should we engage this changing world? We've just outlined a few things we need to do differently at home, but how do we engage the changing world? And I have 4 questions that will take us into the next part of the discussion. Is this a time that favors military responses over diplomatic and development capabilities and leadership? Think about that question. Is this a time to have at least some diplomatic representation in every country in the world that we have relations with? Not we've got to have everywhere. It's hard to influence people if you're not talking to them. And every international organization. Does the U.S. need its diplomats to speak local languages, understand local cultures, and to be the best trained and most effective diplomats in the global community? And I put this last bit in here on purpose. I'm a draftee. I served in the military during Vietnam. And I remember getting that terrible haircut and then being taken in to get my new clothes. And there was a big sign, I don't know how many of you were in the military, but there's a big sign as you start to get your first GI clothes. It says, America has the best led, best trained, best fed, best equipped military in the world. We've always thought that we wanted to do that for the military. We have never thought about doing that for our diplomats. We've never said we want to have the best trained, the best equipped diplomats in the world. Training is something that has been hard to come by for a variety of reasons. And is this a time to be energizing the global community to help deal with transnational issues that affect not just international prosperity and international stability, but affect our own prosperity and our own stability? Now, I don't mean to stack the deck in the way I pose these questions. I would argue they flow logically from every slide that went before. But the deck is being stacked by the budgets that are under consideration in Washington now, particularly in the House. And what I want to say about those budgets is that they're really undermining diplomatic readiness. Now, diplomatic readiness is a term that Colin Powell coined when he became Secretary of State. Where do you think he got that idea? From his military career. And when he came into the State Department, and actually I participated in some of his early briefings on international environmental issues, he was a breath of fresh air because he asked very good questions. He clearly saw us as part of his team, not the enemy. But he also started asking questions about, are we ready to do what we need to do? And let's take a look at a couple of the budgets that are on the Hill right now. First, there's the Ryan Budget Plan, which is the overall House of Representatives budget. And if you look at that budget plan's budget for diplomacy and development, first of all, there's a lot of text in that budget outlining various policy initiatives. There's not a word about international affairs. There are words about the military, not a word about globalization or international affairs or a changing world and the need to have the tools. There's something about the military. It cuts the budget by $6 billion over the President's requests. And it keeps cutting through fiscal year 16. So the President and the Congress had a budget here. The President proposed a slight increase. They're proposing to cut it overall. And then they keep those cuts going through 16. And then slowly start to increase it so that by fiscal year 22, the budget for development and diplomacy would be back where it was in 12. That was the sort of overall broad budget for the House, budget plan for the House of Representatives. The House Appropriations Committee has done a more specific budget, and it's similar to the Ryan budget. It stays within the broad outlines because that's why the chairman of the Budget Committee puts out a budget. But the Appropriations Committee has really gone after the operating budgets for the state and aid, the people who do the diplomacy, the people who do development. Really cutting the operating budgets, development assistance, and zeroing out some contributions to some international organizations. So, meaning that we will be making no contributions to those organizations, despite the fact that we have treaty requirements to do so, and putting us in the position of being an international deadbeat. So I would argue that these budgets sort of undermine our diplomatic readiness. And while they undermine our diplomatic readiness, they throw more money at the military. For example, the Ryan budget increases the defense budget $8 billion over the President's request. The President did cut the budget a little bit from the year before, but not that much. And it adds tens of billions more through 2022. Remember I said that diplomacy and development is going down like this, and it kind of comes back up a little bit. Defense just keeps going up. And I'll remind you what Admiral Mullen said. House Appropriations, they didn't do quite as much as Ryan. They actually shaved a little bit. They only increased the budget in the first year by $4 billion over the President's request. So they too cut diplomacy and development, but they have increased the military budget. What's the military's view on diplomatic readiness? Glad I asked that question. Who do you think said that? Secretary of State, retired Foreign Service officer?
Gates.
Wow, that's very good. And Panetta has said it too, more recently.
Was it you?
No, it was Secretary Gates. Secretary Gates. This is, I'm sorry, I took out some words to try to make it fit, but basically this just says we support a strong budget in FY13. We're really not crazy about threats. The world has changed a lot, etc. Who said that? in a letter of March to the Congress from 70 retired generals and admirals, mostly 4 stars, a few 3 stars. And I would remind you of what Admiral Mullen said. We need to demilitarize our foreign policy. Now, the State Department budget, I had occasion to look at this just about a year ago when I was working on a project with RFPs. If you ask the average American, as a polling company did in November of 2010, how much of the federal budget goes for foreign assistance and foreign affairs generally, the answer has been consistently in November 2010, as it has been actually for decades before that. People believe that 25% of the federal budget goes to international affairs. When asked, is that too much? People say, yes, that's too much. And when asked, well, what do you think would be an appropriate amount? They say, we think 10%. 10% would be a good amount. Well, actually, the foreign affairs budget has been around 1% for decades. 1% of the federal budget goes to diplomacy and development. Now, the peace dividend in the 90s resulted in a significant cut to all national security agencies. But it was particularly devastating in the State Department because almost all of the State Department's budget goes to people, not the programs. So when you cut the budget, you stop hiring people. And so this produced a big staffing gap, really hollowed out middle management. It's not just true at state. You can go to the intelligence community and see the same kind of thing. Not quite as severe because they had other programs. And aid was really decimated, quite significantly. Secretary Powell, when he came in, I mentioned the diplomatic readiness, he and his successor, Connie Rice, worked to reverse that. Powell said, why aren't we doing much training here? Where's the training float? Because the DOD, the Defense Department, and the military, they have more positions overall than they have more people than they have positions because they need to send people to training. And when you're training, you can't be doing a job. But the Foreign Service, we're so good, we don't need training. We had no training float. So if somebody was getting training, then there was an empty job somewhere. Until that person was trained in a language or whatever that was out there. So Powell built up a training float, got the Congress to agree to it. That training float floated to Iraq and Afghanistan. But Connie Rice continued. We began to hire more people, began to get a little bit more training, more development assistance to help us begin to anticipate problems, try to deal with them before they became really big challenges or crises. Nevertheless, in fiscal year 08, just at the end of the Bush administration, state had a personnel shortfall of about 2,400 people, and GAO found in fiscal year 6 that 29% of language-designated positions, these are, and that the Foreign Service has always prided itself on speaking the language, 29% of the language-designated positions that we had overseas were filled by people who didn't speak the language, because there hadn't been time to train them for it. That's at the end of 2 secretaries of state actually getting more money, trying to undo the cuts of the 90s. Secretary Clinton continued that. She picked up the mantle of her predecessors. This has been a very bipartisan effort. And continued to get, and she had connections in the Senate, and she continued to get a little more money. But nonetheless, the shortfall at the end of the last fiscal year was 1,800 state and 600 aid. So our 1% of the budget has not been buying us what we needed. And certainly if you think about the things that we saw, how the world was changing, the issues that are out there, the idea of having budget cuts on top of this current situation, not a happy prospect. So what happens if the House budget cuts become a reality? What does this mean for how we do our diplomacy in the future? Well, remember one of those 4 questions I asked was, does it make sense to have somebody in a diplomatic mission in every country in the world? If the House budget cuts are enacted into law this year, we will be cutting staff and we will be closing some diplomatic missions. This is not an official State Department position, but I had a chance to actually talk to a senior official recently and said, hey, what happens if it becomes law? We're going to be cutting and closing. We will be ceding ground, and we're going to create opportunities for other states. We've got those rising states out there. We've got the G20. We have a lot of people who have ideas and think they need to be listened to. and are ready to take initiatives, if we're not out at the top of our game, there's not going to be a vacuum. There are people to fill the vacuum. And we will not be demilitarizing our foreign policy, because if one agency continues to get robust resources while other national security agencies are cut, then the face of the United States abroad is going to be a military face. And the solutions that we'll be able to offer are going to be military solutions. Because remember, Gates and others have said, we can't do some of these missions that need to be done. Other agencies need to be doing these things. So what to do? I don't want to drag this out. I may have spoken a little too long as it is. But the budgets that we've just talked about, the House budgets, basically cut every part of national security except the military. And that is not a recipe for robust future U.S. global leadership. It just isn't. It is a recipe, however, for global decline. And I would argue that if we really want to have a leading role in the world, which I think we must have. I think the U.S. always brings good things to the table. We always have ideas. We always can think of constructive solutions. If you stop and think about it, we are a good example for the world. We're diverse. We're open. We have our foibles, but we talk about them in ways that others don't. So we are a good example. But if we don't have the resources, we're not going to be able to do the kinds of things that can help people learn from that example. So what I would urge you to do, if you're concerned about this, because the Senate has a somewhat different view of the foreign affairs budget than the House, I would encourage you to write your senators, every state has two, and encourage them to support the President's budget. I wouldn't say the President's budget's ideal by any means, but I think it's taken account of our fiscal realities, and it's taken account of the need to make some continued steady investments in our development diplomacy accounts. So supporting the President's budget so that when the Senate and the House meet in conference and there's a budget at the end of the year, the Senate people will be strong in trying to bring a budget to pass that will be consistent with the needs of our diplomacy and our national security in the 21st century. Now, I just want to close by saying that it's really great to be retired, because if I was still working for the State Department, I couldn't say that. I couldn't tell you to lobby anybody. It's against, can't do it. But I'm retired, so I can do that now. But I'm saying this not as someone who's a retired Foreign Service officer. If I was a professor of international relations, or if I was just an analyst, I'd be saying the same thing. And if I was a corporate executive who had international interests, I'd be saying the same thing. And if I was in another line of work, I'd be saying the same thing. The United States really needs to be a global leader. It's in terms of our values, in terms of our economic interests, in terms of our security. The world will be a better place with our leadership. But if we don't have the tools to lead in the competitive environment that now exists because of globalization, we're not going to find as many followers as we'd like, and our ideas are not going to go as far as they should. So with that, I will close, and we'll be happy to take any questions or respond to any comments anybody has. Shoot.
Ambassador, Bin Laden spent what, $500,000 or less than $500,000 to do the 9/11, and since then we have spent a few $1 trillion to, stop it from ever happening again. How do you counterbalance that with that somebody can do so much damage with little amounts of money, and we end up spending trillions of dollars trying to avoid from one little incident to happen?
Well, first of all, though, one of the things that is a reality of globalization is that non-state actors, and even small states, can now leverage the tools of globalization to do things that they couldn't have done 50, 60, 70 years ago. So they really matter. They're really on the playing field of national security. You may recall one of the things I said we need to do in this new world is we need to think about issues differently. One of the ways we need to think about issues, we like to talk about countering terrorism or countering weapons of mass destruction proliferation. But frankly, as a government, what we and what all other governments have done is we have responded to terrorism. we have responded to proliferation. If you're going to counter something, you need to get ahead of the curve. And with terrorism, the way I think you need to think about what is it that makes people terrorists, where do terrorists come from, and how do you get at some of the underlying issues that help support terrorism. It's a lot cheaper to do it at that end. I mean, that's where the development budget comes in, and that's also where smart politics comes in. It's very expensive, as we found, to chase after terrorists. It's very expensive, not just in terms of money, but in terms of psyche. I mean, as I said, have you been in an airport lately? Do you really like taking off your shoes? You know, I watched a guy in a wheelchair today go through the ringer. There are a lot of consequences of approaching issues in the same old way. And we need to think about how we get ahead of issues. We haven't been organized to do that in the past as a government. And that's one of the things when I say we need to build a team at home to really lead abroad. We need to be integrating all the tools that we have in Washington, which is not just state aid, defense, and the intelligence community. Commerce is really important these days. Treasury is important. There are a lot of agencies with domestic orientation that are very relevant in a globalized world in terms of what countries are trying to deal with, the problems they're trying to address. And so I think the way to get ahead of terrorism is to anticipate where it comes from and try to get at some of the root causes. Yeah.
Ambassador, I had a two-part question.
Sure.
First question, who are the adults in the room, like in terms of like the world? You know, you mentioned the United States, but when you look at the global crisis in Europe and just throughout the world, it just seems like there's just a lack of leadership as it relates to dealing with some of these issues. So my first question would be, you know, who are the adults in the room now, and in the future, who do you see them becoming? And then second, as it relates to the development costs, can you actually define what some of those costs would be, and how much of those costs are related to, let's say, the CIA, as well as some of the other government agencies that actually do a lot of the work abroad, in particular? And then last point, how much does politics play into the budget crisis? Because Richard Lugar just lost the election, and so like when you have advocates like that who lose in politics, what type of impact does that have with your development efforts as it relates to issues abroad?
Let's start with the last one first, because I took a lot of malaria pills in my career, short-term memory. As a result, I mean, the budget you're seeing come out of the House is very much a product of politics. I think it's fair to say that the people who've been most energetic on the domestic political stage recently have tended to have a very narrow view of the world, almost an isolationist view of the world. And it was interesting to read Lugar's statement after he was defeated. I've dealt with Lugar a couple times over the years and know his staff pretty well. And he's a very mild-mannered, judicious person, but his statement when he lost was about as tough and biting as it could be. And one of the points that he was making is, we live in a big, complicated world. We can't run away from it. And the campaign that was run against him was about, basically, remember that old musical, I think it was in the 70s, early 80s, Stop the World, I Want to Get Off? Can't do that. So politics, and that's why it's important for groups like CCWA to be active and to help people understand that what happens abroad really matters at home today in a way that it really never did before. And all you got to do is take a look at gas prices, as I said earlier. So politics is very important. In terms of the adults in the room, the problem with the European crisis is that you've got a lot of democracy there. Every state has its own view of things, and you've got elected representatives, and then you have the Brussels superstructure. So there's a lot of tensions in a very unintegrated financial and political model there. They've tried to integrate economics, but the politics is not integrated, and so it's very challenging for them to make crisp decisions. And they look at things in different ways. I think it's reasonably clear that the things we learned in Economics 101, that demand matters, is being borne out in some parts of Europe. And so we'll see what happens. But I think the larger issue down the road And even today, you're seeing some states that have not traditionally been seen as global players as being global players. And a really good example of this is Turkey on Syria. The Erdogan government has been very active on Syria, was active on Libya. It's a moderate Muslim state. I mean, I was ambassador to Cyprus. I've had a lot of dealings with Turkey. They haven't always been as constructive as they might, but you can engage with them, and they've been a close ally of ours for decades. But they're playing a role in Syria that would be hard for us to play. The G20, as I mentioned earlier, is definitely more important today than it was even 3 years ago, and in many ways is beginning to eclipse the G. People talk about the G8, really the G7. The Russians are just sort of have a courtesy pass. Been looking for money to help with the Euro bailout. The G20 was approached, not the G8, because they were all in Euro. People were going to China, India, Brazil. So I think. And that's my point. If we are going to deal with rising powers, with leaders who think they have something to contribute, we need to know them. We need to speak their languages. We need to understand their politics. We need to get in early, try to shape their thinking. And we can only do that if we have the tools in our diplomacy and our development toolkit. If all the tools are over in the kinetic toolkit, the military force, it's going to be a lot harder to do. And then your middle question about development costs. Well, you have to realize that the intelligence community is part of the defense budget. It's not in the development budget. The foreign affairs, the international affairs budget is essentially state and AID. It used to be state, AID, and commerce, but that's been changed. Although commerce is over in a somewhat different committee right now. Although some aspects of commerce's budget is the foreign commercial services budget is very important to state. And to commerce, but look, the entire international affairs budget is about 10% of DoD's budget.
Yeah, I'll make a comment and have a question. So I was a career foreign service officer with the Foreign Aid Program. So the comments you're making about the overall budget, and I couldn't agree with more. And I think the figure I heard, you said 10%. I heard that the military budget, if you think of foreign affairs, historically it's made up 94% of all foreign affairs expenditures, and diplomacy and development only 6%. And one also hears these things that there are...
that includes intelligence. When you start doing that kind of pie, it includes intelligence.
Then you also hear that there are more employees in the U.S. Military marching bands than we have diplomats worldwide. There are more military employees on one aircraft carrier than we have diplomats and development specialists worldwide. And you see this pervasive effect of the military throughout the diplomatic and development world too. You see a great emphasis on development put on Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Iraq in areas where the military is very active. I'll say one more thing, then I'll ask my question. And you may want to comment on this, in fact. You see two countries that are very important to the United States right now, where a lot of our influence and contacts and historically funding and money have come through the military, is Pakistan and Egypt. So, Egypt's having an election. They're very important for the Arab Spring. They're a central country, and our strong relationships there with the military. And the military leaders become their own power. They have their own businesses, they have their own economy. It's an entity unto itself, and the question is, how does that affect what happens in the future? And the same in Pakistan. There's historically, U.S. government support's gone tremendously into the military there, and there's a whole separate ruling entity that's independent of the government and has their own businesses, its own culture. And I guess my question is, how does that change? Even now when I see the executive branch proposes cuts, the legislative branch won't allow cuts. Even when for weapon systems that the executive branch doesn't want, the legislative won't allow that. So how does that change to address the kinds of issues that you're talking about?
Well, it's not the executive branch doesn't want the weapon systems, the military doesn't want them. And so the executive branch is not proposing it. I'm not arguing against a strong military. I hasten to add, I want to have a robust national security toolbox. And there's a role for military power. My point is that it cannot predominate our other tools, or we will not reap the kinds of opportunities and benefits we need in this new world. Military-to-military relations are important, and frankly, the good relationship we have with the military in Egypt helped keep the Arab Spring that started there, in Tahrir Square. It helped keep it peaceful and moving forward. I mean, I think the exposure that the Egyptian military had through our service schools and other things was helpful in that regard. And I think military-to-military relations are important in the long run. We have a lot of different irons in the fire that have paid off for us with both the Pakistan and the Egyptian militaries. But the key is, it comes back to the politics that was asked earlier, and it is, we have to get, in my opening comments about the fact that I have this secret, the world's changing. People in Washington need to hear that from their constituents here at home. Hey, the world's changing. How come you're doing things the same old way? If we put a round peg into a square hole, what are we going to get? Probably not success. Maybe a lot of friction. I mean, our goal should be to prevent conflict, not to fight them. In the military, we'll tell you that first of all. The people who hate going to war the most are the military. Actually, diplomats can be a little more robust on the use of force than the military. And I come back to the point that Gates is making. What he's saying here is there are things they can't do. But the Congress keeps giving them money to do it. And he transferred an aid program that had been given to him by the Congress to state. The year after it came to state, the budget for that program was cut by the Congress in half. And it wasn't enough to start with. We need to have a new mindset in Washington, and not in the executive branch. The executive branch gets it. The think tank community gets it. The academic community gets it. The business community gets it. But a good example of the political class not getting it is the current discussion about the law of the sea treaty. How many of you here think we belong to the law of the sea convention? Anybody thought about it? You probably haven't. Been around since Nixon started the negotiation. Yesterday, Secretaries Panetta and Clinton, the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, testified in favor of U.S. ratification of the law of the sea convention. They will be followed in the next few days by the head of the Chamber of Commerce, by a number of businesses in the energy field, the shipping field, the telecommunication field. I mean, the business community is behind this 100%. The military has always been behind it. The environmental community is behind it. But there's a sort of a handful, maybe 10 or 15 senators, for whom it's almost a theological issue, not even ideological. And the questions that were asked at the Foreign Relations Committee yesterday by opponents of the treaty were all based on misconceptions and not on facts. And so there's just, we need to get people to realize that the world is changing, that we need to be part of it if we want to. We have a lot of cheap rhetoric about U.S. leadership of the world. You know, if you don't give yourself the tools to lead in today's world, you can't get by on your name anymore. What did you do for me lately? So if we're going to get changes, it's going to have to come from people letting their representatives know that, hey, the world's changing. We need to change with it because we want to lead. We want the United States to continue to be the leading power. But we don't do it as a lone ranger. What do we do it as? A smart arranger. Yeah, I'll take as many questions as you want, but yes, ma'am.
My question is a little bit different, but you make me feel very depressed listening to your comments.
But you can do something.
Yes, well, wonderful, I think we should. But the question I wanted to ask you, it strikes me that in a lot of these countries, such as in Syria and Egypt right now, a lot of those people who are demonstrating, because they all of a sudden are the grassroots, they're coming up and they're getting a lot of their information through the social media.
Right.
What effect do you think that might have as far as producing a more democratic system for some of these other countries?
Well, we'll have to see. I think the jury's out on this. As I mentioned earlier, you've got rising expectations. You've seen that definitely in Syria. I mean, Syria's gone through this before in the 80s and Assad's father leveled the whole city. But there was no Twitter, Facebook, internet, there was no cell phone cameras, and that happened, off stage. There were rumors about it, but there was never any evidence, because he sealed it off and nobody got in. Social media and the internet and cell phone cameras have brought the picture and the stories out to people. So it's very clear that globalization has given people the tools to act on their desire to be more, whether it's politically or economically or otherwise. I mean, what happened in Egypt was a generation was saying, we want to be part of the political system, and we want to be part of the economic system. We want jobs, and we want to have a vote. Now, whether it's going to wind up with more democracy, too early to tell. I frankly was surprised that the Muslim Brotherhood went back on their word in Egypt and ran a candidate. I thought they would sit it out for a little bit. We'll have to see. I mean, this may, in the first wave, the first generation of governments and political movements that may benefit the most in the post-Arab Spring era, will probably be the best organized, and those will be the Islamists, because they were underground for so many years and were organized. I think over time, we will have more openness, more transparency. But don't be surprised if there's an interregnum where it doesn't look so good. People start saying, well, who lost Egypt? Well, it wasn't ours to lose. And I think in the long run, these changes are going to be to our benefit, and certainly they are consistent with our values, the principles of the
Is there a program already in place to hire people with bilingual backgrounds to staff the various embassies throughout the world? And do we have a program to train others to act and behave differently than which you've been counting on?
Well, the State Department has made a change in the way it hires people, specifically to get at languages and some other skills that are particularly important. When Bill and Heather and I took the Foreign Service test, you took the test, if you passed the oral, the written part, and the oral part, then you just came in. You didn't even have to graduate from college, you just had to pass the test. Now you have to submit a resume. They really want to get at people who have language skills, or who have some other particular skills they're looking for, so they can begin to identify people who not only have passed the test, but can come and bring things that we really need. We've always had a great ability to train people in languages. The Foreign Service Institute is probably one of the premier global institutions for training people in languages. We always use native speakers. I think it's quite good. And I think as Powell made it clear that a Foreign Service officer may be pretty smart, but nobody can get away without training in a career, because the world's changing too fast. And he made training something you needed to have to get promoted, not quite the way the military, although I think that would be a good model. So the Foreign Service Institute is doing a better job of providing professional training and training people in some of the new issues that we need to deal with as diplomats that weren't there 5 or 10 years ago. So if we get the budget resources, we've got the infrastructure to do what needs to be done. And we've got, there's still lots and lots of people who sign up to take the Foreign Service test and want to be diplomats. So there's a big pool of talent out there that you need money to hire. Can I take one last question if anybody's got one? Or? Yeah, the chairman should get it.
And you can be as creative as you want, but given your life in diplomacy and what you've seen and the trends you've identified, where you think it's going, where you think the U.S. is probably not leading in the diplomatic world, what are to you the issues that scare you the most about the future?
Well, one of the things that, and I've been working on nuclear security recently. I think Heather may have sent around an op-ed I did recently. I was in Seoul just before the Nuclear Security Summit, and I'm going to be going back there in a few weeks for another session. Nuclear security, weapons of mass destruction, terrorism, is a very significant military mission. The most immediate concern is nuclear terrorism. People getting a hold of fissionable material and able to produce an improvised nuclear device that would have yield, that would kill a lot of people and make a lot of property damage. It would change, I think if it happened in the United States, it would change our politics profoundly, and not for the better. It would change the economy. If it happened anywhere in the world, it would be a big blow to the global economy and to international security generally. It would have a lot of negative downstream consequences. The longer-term challenge of WD terrorism is bioterrorism. The thing about nuclear terrorism is if you do what President Obama is trying to do, which is to secure all nuclear material. If there's no material, you can't have a nuclear weapon. Impossible. Doesn't matter what you know. You can't do it. With bio, they're teaching kids to do genetic engineering in AP classes now, in high school. And pathogens are everywhere. So the long-term challenge in the sort of terrorism realm worries me the most is bioterrorism. And how we deal with that without undermining the ability to take advantage of the life sciences, human health, animal health, plants, responding to climate change, other kinds of things. The other longer-term concern, there's two others. One is the impact of climate change and the environment generally. I think you're going, and I talked about failed states, I think you're going to see, I hope it doesn't happen, but I think it's quite possible you're going to see failed states failing because of environmental problems. Whether it's because rising sea levels suddenly make 20 million refugees, 30 million refugees in Bangladesh. Where do they go? They go to India. India's not going to be that happy. They go to Burma. Neither one is going to be happy with that. It's going to create regional tensions, regional political and security tensions, and potentially economic drawbacks. And the same is true of fresh water supplies, and the impact that could have on migration and on the economy generally, the global economy generally. So I think the environment is a big long-term issue that we really need to pay attention to. Two others. And cyberspace is one where we need to get it right. And we haven't even begun to do the diplomacy on cyberspace that we need to do. We have the Vienna Convention on how you conduct war, right? We need a Vienna Convention on cyberspace because, as I said earlier, we are not the sole superpower anymore. We're pretty robust in cyberspace, but so are the Chinese, so are the Russians, so are the Iranians, so are the Israelis, so are a lot of people, and so are a lot of hackers. We need to have rules of the road that states will say, yeah, we can live with this, and begin to have some predictability in state behavior and in policing cyberspace against non-state actors. Because as we go to smart grids and things like that, we are going to be increasingly vulnerable to cyber attacks with profound implications for our economy and human health and other kinds of things. So we've got, that's a big area for diplomacy. We've really been addressing only from intelligence and from a security point of view. We've got to get the diplomacy right. We've got to get other people to recognize and to become part of the enforcement. There's a need for enforcement. There's a need for rules of the road. We can't do it. You cannot do this by yourself. It's got to be a team effort. And then finally, I just worry that that a world without U.S. leadership will be a less prosperous, or more violent, and a less democratic world. I just think that human rights, look, I'll be the first to say we've made mistakes. Let's start with Iraq. But on the whole, we have tended to be a very positive force for prosperity, stability, and good values in terms of governance and human rights. And if we don't keep our eye on the ball about how the world is changing, what do we need to do to continue to be the leading nation, not the sole remaining superpower. We've got to get away from that kind of rhetoric, and to be the country people look to get over some of the problems that we've had in the past, then I'm worried about what the rules are going to be like. So I think all those things relate to some of the stuff we've discussed. So thanks for the time and the attention.
Well, on that note, let me just remind you.
Write your senators.
Wait, yeah, that's exactly it, that you can go home and write your senators. When I was in Peru, my ambassador always made the comment that the expression in English, write to your congressman, just doesn't translate into other languages. And it's true. You can be in so many other countries and somebody's frustrated, they don't know what to do, and you feel like saying, write to your congressman, and they don't know they don't understand the concept. We are lucky that we do understand the concept, and we can at least try to weigh in and express our views. So thank you for giving us that food for thought, and very happy to have had you here. And we Clevelanders are very proud of our music, and so we have a small musical memory from Cleveland.
Thank you very much.
Okay.